Who are the Stoic sages? This is a great question and one that definitely deserves an answer, but it's an answer that I think most people are not going to be all that happy with. Once we start looking into it carefully, we see that this category of sage or wise person, sophos in Greek, sapientes in Latin, is going to be a broad one straddling not just Stoic philosophy, but we could say every wisdom tradition, intentional way of living, philosophy as a way of life, not just in the Mediterranean encompassing Greek and Romans, or even expanded to the Near East, but across the entire world. Who possesses wisdom? Who embodies wisdom? Who acts and thinks and chooses and feels in wise ways? This is a perennial question. And the Stoics do, in fact, have some answers about this. Their answers are a little bit different than many other people. There's that proverbial idea that a sage comes around like a phoenix once every 500 years. They measure up to this almost unattainable summit of human development. The Stoics also portray the sages as in perfect control of their emotions, living completely in accordance with nature, having all of the virtues, which includes not just the cardinal virtues and their sub-virtues in wisdom, justice, temperance, courage, but also being sympathikos, being a good drinking companion, or being a good party person, being erotikos, being a good lover, right? So they're the perfect human being. They also possess the capacity for genuine knowledge, not the kind of knowledge that the rest of us have. They have kataleptike phantasiae in Greek, right? Which is modeled as, like a fist closing in on another fist. They also don't just do appropriate actions or fulfill their duties. The things that they do are entirely good. They have the right motivations, unlike the rest of us. Rum-dums or schmucks, or as the ancient Stoics would call us all, fools. Now, this is where we get to a very interesting peculiarity of the Stoic point of view. They often portray the sage or wise person as if once you cross that threshold and you're on this side of wisdom, you are a very different kind of person. Everybody else is bad. Everybody else is foolish. Everybody else has wrong ideas. Everybody else is in some disharmony with nature. The sage alone actually has it right. And you can say, well, how the hell do I make it over there? And this is where a third category, very important for the Stoics, comes in, the prokoptoi or proficientes. That is, those who are making progress, who are still not sages, probably never will be, but are not just foolish people, somewhere in between. How do you cross the threshold into sagehood? You got to work really, really hard, and you'll probably not make it. But that doesn't have to dishearten you. As Epictetus himself says, I may not become a Socrates, but at least I can become the Epictetus, the best Epictetus that I can be. And so, this is an important set of reflections. We should be very wary of people in the present who talk about classic Stoic figures as if they were indeed sages, never getting anything wrong. So Epictetus, not a sage. We'll tell you directly that he isn't. Marcus Aurelius, great guy, not a sage. Seneca, definitely not a sage. Both of them tell you that they aren't the sage. Musonius Rufus is not the sage. Heracles is not the sage. So who would the Stoics actually consider to have been sages? There's two legendary people that come up quite a bit, both of whom might seem a little bit strange to us in the present. One of them is Heracles or Hercules, who is also viewed as a representative person by the Cynics, who, of course, feed into the Stoic philosophy. they're regarded as, he's regarded as a good person who used his strength to, undo injustice and impose justice. He winds up being deified, being made one of the Olympian gods eventually. So that kind of makes sense. And then there's Odysseus, who, he's kind of a wily, tricky guy. Lies on a lot of occasions, engages in ruses. He is bold, he is courageous. He is also considered to be one of the wiser of the Greeks. Mentor perhaps gives better counsel than Odysseus, but Odysseus is pretty darn close. Those are legendary people who would actually be included among the potential sages from, we could say, living history. Well, Seneca says that Cato was the closest thing that he ever saw. Cato the Younger, military commander, Stoic practitioner. So, he's a good representative. If you don't know the story of Cato, he, among many other things, fought in the Civil War against Julius Caesar, reluctantly joining the side of Pompey and the Senate because they were the lesser of two evils, but, commanding his troops as he ought to, and then committing suicide afterwards so he couldn't be used as a propaganda tool by the victorious Caesar. Two other people who come up quite frequently: Socrates, the great philosopher, understood by the Stoics not primarily through Plato, but more through Xenophon and then, oral traditions probably about Socrates. Diogenes, the cynic, who came from Sinope to Athens, acted like kind of a goofy person, but was engaged in trying to, like Socrates, draw his fellow citizens towards virtue. They're sometimes viewed by the Stoics as being sages. With what we know about them, sometimes that might be a little questionable. Epictetus actually has something very interesting to say about Socrates, Diogenes, and Zeno, the founder of Stoicism. He tells us that each of them did what they ought to do. Each of them served the gods by doing different things. Socrates went around and asked people questions, pointed questions, right? Diogenes went around and harangued people, got in their face and said, the life you're living is crap, you need to act in a different way. Zeno was much more sedate and calm and taught people. And it's kind of intimated that the sage would take on different roles depending on, what kind of situation they're in. Was Zeno a sage? Zeno doesn't say that he's a sage in anything that we have, in any of the fragments. There's some, tradition that Zeno and his successor Cleanthes may have considered themselves sages, but that Chrysippus explicitly denies that he is a sage. This is all rather dubious, and I think we can say that while the ancient Stoics thought that Zeno, Cleanthes, Chrysippus, and the other scholarchs, Diogenes, Antipater, were good people and working on themselves, they were not yet sages. So we don't really have a lot of examples of Stoic sages. And we should think to ourselves, well, what do we want? In asking, who are the sages? What are we trying to get? Is it merely an ideal that we need to work towards? It's nice to have like a goalpost, a benchmark. Even if it's completely unattainable for us, it kind of inspires us to go after it. That might work for some people. We can also ask, are there sages we don't know about? Could there be sages all around us that are doing a great job and we just don't know that they're sages? There's even a discussion whether the sage will know that he or she is a sage or not. That runs throughout some of the Stoic literature. We should, say they could be at best role models. Should we accept them as role models? Should we think of whoever we count as a Stoic sage as in some way like being a teacher for us? If we think of Socrates, for example, as a sage, can we do as Marcus suggests, that we approach situations and ask, well, what would Socrates say about this situation? What would he say about my behavior in it? That might be useful. There is, in fact, a practice that's been developed by modern Stoics, basically imagining yourself in the presence of a sage who's watching you. Now, the sage, of course, wouldn't get ticked off with you and say, I'm going to punish you for being bad or anything. They might not even feel pity or compassion, aleos in Greek, towards you, but they could at least say, wow, man, you're screwing up. Here's how you could do better. So the long and short answer of this is there's a lot of candidates for being sages. We know quite a bit about what the Stoics think a sage hypothetically would feel like, think like, behave like, talk like. But we don't have a lot of people who we can point to and say, that's definitively a Stoic sage. We have, at best, candidates that are looked to by many people within classic and modern Stoicism as having been sages.